Can you hear me here?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you now. Meghna, I just want to tell you, I have not told this before. So today, this talk would be live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Hopefully that is fine with you. And we will also like to put up the video of this talk on YouTube channel of ADRI.
Okay, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so shall I start right away?
Um, are we expecting more people to join from ADRI? ADRI theke, I can see other people are likely to join.
No, we can start. 15 people have already joined. That's good enough.
Okay. So yeah, we welcome Meghna, who is an assistant professor at Indian Institute of Technology, Patna, to present her paper today at ADRI. And without taking much time, I would ask her to present her talk. So over to you, Meghna.
Sure. Thank you, Ashmita. This is really a great opportunity for me to be interacting with all of you, especially with I have other special connections with ADRI and know you all personally. So I'm really happy to be invited for this talk. Is my screen visible to you all?
Yes.
So this is a joint paper that we wrote quite a few, it's a bit old, I think 1919, 1920 is when this came out. This is a joint work with Dr. Niladri, and it was funded from a NABARD project. So the project was, sorry? Okay. So the talk is credit constraint and intra-country production reorganization. So basically the survey was conducted in Maharashtra, and the data that we present, the results that we present are based on the survey that was conducted in 2 districts of Maharashtra. Now, informal sector or unorganized sectors, though they are not the same, we will use the 2 terms interchangeably for this presentation. It has been a topic of much debate, discussion, studies for all developing countries, by and large. And most developing countries, structured by structure, there exists this huge unorganized sector, which employs a large proportion of the population, the workforce, generates a significant amount of value added, and also export earnings. Now, in the literature, there are basically 3 dominant views with respect to unorganized sector. One is that unorganized sector comprises mostly of firms which are not too productive. So mostly these are firms which have low productivity, and for the entrepreneur of such firms, it is a survival strategy. Right? So this is one avenue which has been, avenue of the argument which has been highlighted by Laporta, Schleifer, Levy, so on and so forth. The other hand of this argument is, which is very contrasting, are based on works of De Soto, his 1989 and 2000 famous works, which considered the unorganized sector or the informal sector to be actually a pool of potentially productive firms, but who operate at their less than full potential level, owing to regulations, entry regulations mostly. Right? So the regulations that a firm has to undertake to move towards, to move into the formal sector, they are so binding, so cumbersome that these firms remain informal because they cannot bear the cost of formality. However, both this line of argument accept that for most informal firms, credit remains a major point of interest. one of the major issues that these firms face is credit unavailability. So what is the Indian story with respect to this literature? In India, the unorganized sector accounts for about 50% of GDP, of which the textile sector is the second largest after agriculture. And it contributes significantly to the pool of employment. This textile sector is also the third largest when it comes to base of fixed assets. However, it is also the sector which faces tremendous credit issues. It lacks credit availability. So wherein lies the problem? Because we see from government reports and data that the sector is producing a huge amount of output or value added, generating huge value added. They have a huge asset base. So where is the problem that results in this credit crunch? A major problem has been that the fixed asset that this sector owns, the informal firms own, are not documented properly. So the ownership of this asset is not documented. Therefore, this asset cannot be readily lent as collateral to borrow money from the formal banking institutions. So even though I have a farm, even though the farm owns fixed asset, because it is not registered properly in my name, or there are some other problems related to documenting the ownership of such firms, I cannot get loans, formal sector loans, that is. So this creates ex ante problems of adverse selection that we know of, and ex post problems of moral hazard. So apart from this, there is another restrictions, I should say, in generating or in obtaining loan, which is the
Meghna, I would like to interrupt you a bit.
Yes.
Sorry, the slideshow is not moving.
The slideshow is not moving. Okay.
Yeah, now it is moving. We can see the Indian story.
Let me, so if in full screen, let me just see if is it moving?
No, right now we are still in one slide. What is the India story?
The full screen mode, probably this is not moving, so I'll keep it small. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Okay, so this is where we were. So the problem, apart from that, the documentation problem, the problem of documentation of these assets, the other major problem is on part of the formal banks who lend to commercial banks and cooperative banks who lend to these firms. Now, for these firms, for the banks, the transaction cost of processing small loans is quite significant. And moreover, the banks do not know a priori what is the worth of the asset base of this firm, what is the profitability of these firms, and therefore the firms are skeptical in lending, the banks are skeptical in lending to these firms. Moreover, earlier there was this issue of priority sector lendings, under which the banks would lend to the small and marginal enterprise. But over the period, the definition of priority sector has been diluted considerably. So now, even under priority sector, we have housing loans, education loans, even consumption loans, transport loans, so on and so forth. So therefore, because the firms are not aware of the profitability of the informal firms, under priority sector lending also, the banks choose to give such housing loans, education loans, and not lend to the small units. Right? So that again becomes a hindrance for the small firms in obtaining formal sector loans. So the study that we given this, the study that was based on two districts of Maharashtra, Solapur and Kolhapur. In Solapur, we surveyed the firms that were located in the Solapur municipal area. In Kolhapur, we surveyed firms which was located in Ichalkaranji. Now, Ichalkaranji is also known as the Manchester of Maharashtra. And both these places have a cotton textile industry dating back to the Peshwas. So these are pretty old textile cluster in both this area. In Sholapur, we surveyed close to 100 and we surveyed actually 103 power looms, and in Kolhapur 121 units were surveyed. Now, if we talk about the two study areas, in both these study areas, the Maharashtra Industrial Development Cluster is at the center, right? So the state developed the Maharashtra Industrial Development Cluster, which is the formal sector, which houses the big formal sector firms. Over the period, in and around the MIDC cluster, many small informal firms cropped up. Right? And see, initially, if you have to understand the study area, initially these were vast stretches of agricultural land. When the state decided it will set up the MIDC, it took up the agricultural land, transformed it, and developed the MIDC. Okay? But the adjoining land retained its agricultural land status. But when the textile clusters developed, there was huge migration from of the Padmashali caste. So these are weaver castes. So they migrated from the neighboring states of Karnataka into Maharashtra and settled in and around this MIDC cluster. Developed on the agricultural land around the MIDC cluster. When the formal sector firms discarded looms, these laborers chose to purchase the second-hand looms and set up small production units within their homes. So it would be probably say 2 rooms, small rooms, one where they have set up the looms, 2-3 looms, and in the other room they eat, sleep, and stay. So, you know, it's within the home state that that they run the looms. So that is how the informal sector has grown. But the trouble is, see, the informal sector farms have now developed on agricultural land. The state had converted the land from agriculture to industrial for the MIDC cluster, but the surrounding land, their status have not changed. So now the informal farms are actually on agricultural land, and you cannot use agricultural land for industrial purpose. So with that status, it is difficult for them to approach formal banks and get loans because their homestead or the farms is not registered on their names because it is on agricultural land. So they cannot show it as a collateral to obtain further loans. So this insufficient documentation of ownership right actually makes achieving a competitive equilibrium almost impossible. So how can we ameliorate the problem? There are 2 options. Either you give some form of collateral, maybe jewelry or something else, and then the bank will give you some loans against it. Or you take loans from people who know you personally or know your repayment capability, because now the banks do not know your repayment capability, so they are not willing to lend you without a collateral. For the second part of the problem, that is when I take loan maybe from friends, family, or informal money lenders, either I borrow at a high interest rate or I work as an outsource agent for them. So that is how the production reorganization happened in this area. So the small firms which were credit starved, which could not get loan from the formal sector banks, now started, because they do not have much credit, they started working for big formal sector firms. So what they do is they take raw materials, designs from the big formal sector firms, process the raw material in their homestead farms that they have within their homestead, make the output and sell it back to the formal sector firms, the big firms. So that is how a symbiotic relationship has developed between the formal sector firm within the MIDC cluster and the adjoining informal sector firms. So if we briefly look at the survey data, for Sholapur, the credit requirements that the firms specified, you see, most of the firms have expressed their credit requirement for expansion or technology upgradation. Very few have stated buying raw material as a reason for needing credit, because they are already they have already internalized this option of production reorganization. So to put in a more lucid terms, outsourcing. So these firms were not working on their own, producing and selling on their own. They were working for some other big firms because they cannot get credit to complete the entire production process by themselves. Similarly, if you look at the data from Ichalkaranji, here one dominant problem was middlemen. So people from a particular community here dominated the liaison between the small firms and the big firms, and they worked as middlemen. And majority of the firms, big firms, you see that they have said that they want credit to avoid this middleman, because this middleman, they take away a major portion of the profit, right? And they have reported mostly capital and raw material needs as a requirement for, as a credit requirement. If you look at the frequency of repayment, you see the small firms in both the study areas, confidence on these small firms is very less. So they have to make bi-weekly repayment, mostly, majorly. Very few small firms make monthly repayment. Whereas big firms, if you look at the 9 to 12 or more than 12 category, you see big firms mostly make monthly repayment. Less number of big firms makes bi-weekly repayment. That means if you are a small firms, confidence on your repayment capability is less, so you make repayments more frequently. But if you are a big firm, I am kind of sure that you are able to repay, so you can make monthly repayments. And it is true for both the study areas, Solapur as well as Ichalkaranji. Okay. Moving forward, the observation that we had from the data of both the places, we try to put them into a simple generalized model. We consider an polystick structure. Each producer produces, say, an amount Qi. Now, to produce this amount, they need a capital stock K. We assume that the good requires one period, production of the good requires one period. Now, each individual producer has some own savings with them, a very little savings. Let's call that K tilde. Now, this K tilde that I already have is not sufficient to cover my entire production. That is from purchase of raw material to sell of good. I have an amount of capital, but that falls short of my entire requirement. So for the other half, so with the amount I have, say K tilde, I can only complete B part of the production. So for the 1 minus Bth part, I need to go to bank and borrow. Okay. Now, if I borrow from bank, I have to borrow at, say, interest rate R, capital R. Okay. That is fixed in the international market. I cannot change that. That's a standard assumption. Now, the amount that I have as my savings, K tilde, I have two options. I can earn interest rate for it. Interest rate, say, denoted by small r. Or instead of keeping it in the bank, I can give it into my production. I can pull it into my business and use it for production purpose, so that I have to borrow less from the bank. See, even if I give this amount, give my savings into the production process, I will still have to borrow because it is not sufficient, but I'll have to borrow less. So the small r now becomes, if I use it for my production, the small r now becomes my opportunity cost. Okay. And due to imperfections in credit market, the borrowing rate is greater than the lending rate. So when I borrow from when I take a loan from the bank, I pay a capital R interest rate, which is more than the interest rate I obtain from the bank if I keep my money with the bank, which is a very normal assumption. So if I keep my savings with the bank, I get 5% interest rate. But if I go to borrow from the bank, I borrow it at 10%. So that is what we are implying. And of course, there is alpha, a marginal cost of production. Okay. Now the firm's profit function can be, because it's a duopolistic setup, this is how we can formulate the profit function of the firm when we do not fragment the production. Again, fragmentation is nothing, but we are implying outsourcing. So previously, entire good is produced in-house from scratch to end, it was within one factory, so a single production setup. Now, if I produce half the good and give it to another farm who value adds or produces the other half of it and then sells it, it means fragmentation. Okay. So this is a standard process. We do the the partial derivatives. We set the lambda and do the partial derivatives and set the first order conditions equal to 0. If we do that, we will get Q1. I'm not showing the entire derivation for obvious reasons. Anybody with a pen and paper can solve for it. Let us go into the story is much more interesting. So let us focus on the story. So this Q1 that we get, you see, this is the amount of output. You remember we said QI, each producer produces amount QI. So if I focus on one producer who produces this output, you see this output is directly, but inversely related to the capital R, which means, and K does not feature in this equation, which effectively means that the output does not depend on the initial capital, but the higher the interest rate that I have to pay for my loan, the lower output I will be able to produce, which makes absolute sense. Because if I have to pay more to obtain a loan, I will take less loan and therefore I will be able to produce less output. Now let us consider that we split the production into two parts. So we say that there is a small farm who is taking raw material from a big farm, producing the output, giving it back to the big farm. The big farm is, say, adding some value added, in the sense it is doing the packaging, advertising, and selling the product into the final market. So that is, production is now split between two farms, half and half, let's say. So the small farms produce the output and sell it to the big farm for a price PS, let's say P small s. The big farm now buys back that output, adds some value to it, and sell it for a price P into the final market. So obviously, P will be greater than PS. The small farm will receive PS amount for the product. The big farm will add some value to it and sell it at a higher price P. For simplicity, we assume that there are at least as many downstream firms as upstream firms, which effectively means that one big farm can liaise with many small firms, but no small firms will be left without a big farm. So each farm produces one stage and hence produces half of the output value. So if you solve through the structure, the big incentive for the big farm to engage in outsourcing with another small farm only if this holds, that is, the amount it pays to the small farm is less than alpha into 1 plus R. And the small farm, which is a net borrower, because again, the entrepreneur's own savings is not sufficient to complete the production process, it must borrow this half alpha minus K at an interest rate of capital R from the bank. Again, if we solve through it, we get this equation, which again means nothing but for fragmentation, that is production to be fragmented between two farms, between the small farm and the big farm, the difference between the two interest rate, the borrowing rate and the lending rate, should be sufficiently high. Okay. So has then fragmentation emerged as a solution to the problem of credit unavailability in the study areas? What do we observe? We observe that outsourcing is very prevalent in both the study areas. Most of the informal units sold their output to some big formal production units. So they also get the raw material as well as design specification from the big firms. The smaller units neither required to pay any cash for the raw material nor any brokerage for the brokerage for selling them. The big firms, in fact, also often gave them small loans for purposes of buying, say, new looms, for upgradation of looms, even for personal consumptions. So what effectively happened is the big firms have now emerged to be the new money lenders in the system. The quantity of sale was also fixed. right? So for example, if I am a big firm and I am in an outsourcing contract with say 5 different small firms, I buy say 100 units of output from each of the firms. So this is kind of a symbiotic relationship. The small firms do not have to face the demand fluctuations because it's the demand from the big firm is already fixed. It will buy back 100 units of output from you. And there is also, so the classic problem of the hold up problem that we have seen in the literature of contract theory, that does not arise in this kind of a setup, right? Even though there are no formal contracts between the two firms, the problems of hold up is avoided between the big firms and the small firms. And even suppose one big firm could not deliver on the product for some reason, the big firm does not suffer a loss because it is in liaison with many small firms which is supplying to it. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. Moreover, the big firm do not take any responsibility of labor issues. So it can completely circumvent labor problems, which is now the lookout of the smaller firms who actually do the production. The dominance of the big firms was especially noticeable in Ichalkaranji, where they have converted all the small loom owners to practically piece-rated wage work. Right? So even though they are owners of looms of production units, the informal farm owners work as almost piece-rated wage workers. On the credit front, apart from indebtedness, the cycle of indebtedness that the small producers get into, they also cannot operate at an optimal level that they would that really want to, right? Because see, the big firms have an incentive to restrict supply into the market, right? Because that way they can push up the prices and get the benefit of a higher P. So the order that they place with the small firms is less than what the actual market demand is. So in turn, the small firms operate at a less than optimum level, which corroborates with the literature that we mentioned in the first slide, where many academicians and researchers have said that the informal sector is actually a pool of firms who operate at less than full potential level. So this is what this emerges here in this study area as an important reason why the informal firms are actually operating at less than optimum level. The entity of the moneylender, yarn merchant, local trader, cloth merchant, owner of the big formal sector firm is now, so the boundary between them is blurred. So it is one and the same entity now who dwells up as all these entities. And the absence of a formal credit supply chain, in absence of that, because banks, cooperatives are unwilling to lend to these informal units, the big formal sector firms, they collude them, and the middlemen, they collude among themselves to have absolute control over raw material market, credit market, and output market. And therefore, the small farm owners have no option but to work to survive. They have to work as outsourced agent, because if they try to move, produce independently, they do not get access to raw material. They do not get access to credit. Formal sector does not lend to them, so they cannot complete the product on time, and they lack the network to sell it into the output market. So they have really no option but to work as outsourced agents. Now this data, the survey data, will lend it to some econometric study so that we can figure out a causal relation, a deterministic relationship between outsourcing decisions of the small firms and what affects their outsourcing decision. So because the dependent, so we take the dependent variable to be whether the firms are working on outsourcing contract. So we are ask the respondent if they are working on outsourcing contract or not. And because it's a dichotomous variable, we do a logistic regression. So what we have are the odds ratio. Now the important variable that we are interested in is of course credit constraint, and we see that between a credit constraint firm and a non-credit constraint firm, that is a firm which is not getting credit and a firm which is getting credit, the former would is working as an outsourcing contract at least 5.44 times more. So if you are credit constrained, you are likely to work as an outsourced agent 5.44 times more than a firm who do not have credit issues. Okay. Now, this variable, present value of machinery, the worth of machinery of the firm, even though it is significant at 5% level, odds ratio, it turns out to be have an odds ratio of 1, which effectively means that for the small firms, if they are in need of money or revenue, they simply work more shifts. So their decision to work on outsourcing contract is irrespective of their present value of machinery or their present worth of machinery. So so their worth of machine, they will work more shifts, okay, to generate more revenue. So the worth of machinery is actually not important that ways. Value of the output produced, this is interesting in the sense, if the value of output increases in the final market, the output market, small firms actually do not, less small firms are likely to work on outsourcing contract. This also corroborates our hypothesis that the small firms are paid less. So if in the output market, the price of the good increases, instead of working for somebody else, they would independently want to produce the output, sell it in the market and get the higher price. That is what they would want to do. But why they can't do it? Because they do not have credit to complete the entire process by themselves. Okay. Productivity turns out to be highly significant, and the more productive the firm is, they are more likely to work on outsourcing contract. Now, if we go by theory, this indulges us to look into another question, whether more productive firms outsources more or outsourcing makes the firm more productive. So there can be a dual causality. And in an earlier work, we had actually formal sector firms. There we found that the formal sector firms, the more productive the firm is, the less they want to work on outsourcing. But here for the informal sector firms, we find that the more productive they are, the more they are willing to work on outsourcing contract. Again, possibly because even if they are productive, they cannot get credit to independently work. So the only way they can generate more revenue and more profit for working more on outsourcing contract, because they are more productive, they will be able to generate more output and therefore, be able to have more profits. Number of unit installed. If you have more number of unit installed, of course, they lend. So increasing the number of unit installed by one more loop means you are more likely to work on outsourcing contract. But we would not like to harp on this particular variable because it is marginally more than 1. The value is not very high. The difference between 1 and 1.05 is not very huge. So we would like to not draw very drastic conclusions from this. Now we lend the data to some subsample regressions, mainly because we want to have some robustness check. So to see that the results do not drastically different, if we change the settings somewhat, we do some subsample regressions. What we do is we divide the entire data set into 2 groups, small firms and big firms. The definition is we have taken firms which have less than equal to 10 looms as small firms, and those who have more than 10 looms, we call them big firms. That is how we have differentiated the data set into 2 groups, run the same set of regressions, and we find, see, present value of machinery does not change much. It's very marginal. In fact, for the big firms, it's not even significant. But the variables we they are able to work on outsourcing contract if they are credit constraint compared to firms which are not credit constraint. Even for big firms, even though the coefficient is slightly less, it is highly significant at 1%, indicating that credit constraint is the major reason why the group of firms, informal firms, would actually work on outsourcing contracts. Productivity and technology as well, they remain significant. Of output maintain the same directions of explanation. So the results, when we have the full sample, does not change when we test them for subsample regression. We have another group of subsample regressions where we divide the firms between low technology firms, high technology firms, and less productive firms and more productive firms. So in the low and high technology firms, credit constraint, see, for the low technology firms, credit constraint is highly significant with a very high coefficient for all of them, indicating that credit constraint remains a major issue. Present value of firms still maintained, even though for the low tech firms, it is 1.17. So there's a slight improvement with respect to their low tech firms, but for the other group of firms, it maintains, it's close to 1, and some cases it's not significant. The value of output produced, so it's the same. If the value of output produced increases in the market, small firms, the low tech firms, high tech firms, productive and more productive, all kinds of firms would actually want to work independently, but they cannot, possibly because they do not have sufficient amount of credit to complete the entire process by themselves. So even after we lend the data to such econometric analysis, we find that the premise that which we started the study, that credit constraint forces the small informal firms to operate at a suboptimal level. They lack working capital. In absence of credit, a source of credit from the formal lending channels as commercial bank, cooperative banks, so on and so forth, they are hugely restricted from operating at the optimal level. They have to circumvent the problem of credit availability. They have now reorganized the entire production system structure into a outsourcing contract type of mode, where they take raw materials from a bigger firm, produce the output, and sell it back to the bigger firm from whom they have got the raw materials. In the process, working merely as in the process, remaining as piece-rated wage workers. So even though they are entrepreneurs, they are owners of firms, they are in reality nothing but piece-rated wage workers who get paid on piece-rated basis. So it has completely changed the characteristics of formal firms also, who now play the role of what previously we knew as money lenders. And they focus only on their core competencies instead of manning the production structure in-house. So that is all with respect to this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello.
So I would like to invite people to, if they
I can't seem to hear you.
1 second, let me put on my headphones.
Hello, am I audible now?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so I was just thanking you for this excellent presentation. So I would first like to invite questions and comments from the audience. So please feel free to ask Meghna or raise your questions if you have any. And then we'll go on, and I don't know what is happening. People are still joining in the talk now. Uh,
Maybe they got disconnected in between.
yeah. So, one thing that I wanted to ask you is that do you have information on the kind of workers that are employed in smaller versus big firms? And did you do any
Uh,
analysis on, like, for example, the kind of, uh, apart from, say, profitability, the kind of production that they undertake? So, is it like more labor intensive in the small firm versus more capital intensive in the big firms? Or basically, like,
yes,
do they make the laborers work greater number of hours and so on?
yes. So the small farms were more labor intensive, of course, compared to the bigger formal sector firms. The kind of laborer and another aspect was, see, in Sholapur, the entire production, the all the parts of the production. So forming the yarn, coloring of the yarn, the thread into different colors, wrapping it up into bobbins, fitting it into the kandi machine, the taking the several yarns and actually knitting out the clothes. Everything happened in house within the informal sector firm. So they took care of all the parts of the production within themselves. But for Ichal Karanji, they only knitted, what we call than. So the white cream colored cloth, they would make huge extent of it. And then the cloth went to Gujarat and a place called Pali Balotra, where they got colored. The clothes were colored because there were some environmental issues in Ichal Karanji. So coloring did not happen there. They only knitted the cloth there. So between the two places, the demand for labor was a bit different, but nonetheless, the formal sector firms had less labor. They were more capital intensive, and even in capital intensive, they focused their core competence on getting back the product, tagging it, making it into the lots where how they would sell it, and then finally dispatch it for sales. But the actual production in both the places happened in the informal sector, and they would buy back in piece rate basis from this informal sector. The informal sector also employed a lot of family labor, right? But the one problem that the informal sector had was they were dependent on migrant labor. So when the migrant labor came, when I'm hiring a migrant labor, I also have to give him an advance. That is a huge chunk of money, say 25,000, 30,000. Without this advance, he will not stay with me. If any other firm offers him an advance, he will go to that firm. Now, this advance, the worker needs to meet his consumption needs. But the farm owner upfront needs to pay this huge amount of advance to the laborer to retain him. And then he can deduct it as the contract with the laborer is, but upfront this has to be paid. And then there were weekly wages to the kandi machine operator, to the weaver, so on and so forth. So they needed weekly more money to pay the laborers. This weekly requirement was not there for the bigger firms. So we did an analysis, but that is not a part of this particular paper. The labor.
So that can be a separate interesting paper
Yes,
as well.
we got so much of information. The beauty of primary survey is you get so much of information that you can, take up each issue separately.
Right. So another thing that you mentioned in the presentation was that for the so when you're looking at mostly the credit from the formal sector, right? So what about so you mentioned something about the informal networks that the big firms have. Can you hear me? The role of networks in getting
Yes.
credit, right? Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, I think, no, can you just repeat it once more?
So at one point in your presentation, if I understood correctly, you were talking about the role of networks in terms of like caste networks, I would assume, in getting credit, in access to credit, right? Was it that you were talking about? That
The caste network was dominant as far as the laborers were concerned, because this is particular Padmashali caste from Karnataka who are weaver. So their caste occupation is, so they have moved to this from Karnataka to Maharashtra, and they are mostly dominant in workers in this textile industry. As far as the credit network is concerned, see, because they cannot get loan from formal sectors, the other option is to get it from friends, family, such sources. But the interest rate is so high and repayments so frequently, and moreover, the repayments are not documented. So I paid you 3 times, but it is documented once. Right? So it's a perpetual cycle. So my loan goes on and on. So what they have effectively, to circumvent that problem, what they have effectively done is now they take loan from the firm that they work for. That makes things much easier for. So that is how the formal firms have emerged as a money lender also.
all right. Yeah. So I would like to ask if someone else has any question or comments on the paper. I think there is something in the chat box.
No, yes.
Would want to whether the research has found out any percentage between the tendency of the small micro informal firms engaging with wage labor under contract and family unpaid labor. So
Anand, I'm not sure what you mean by this. Can you please elaborate a bit?
Yeah, Anonu, please ask your question. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Do you mean how much of unpaid labor they use and how much of family labor they use? Okay, so see, they prefer to use family labor, but so they have to use some amount of wage labor also. Even though informal firms do use family labor, we have the data on how much of family labor it is and how much of wage labor it is. We can give you the numbers, though I do not recall the percentage exactly now, but we can give you the numbers. But yes, they have to use, see, some of the work are specialized, and not with the family labor also, they cannot get it done. Right? So the loom operator, they was a wage laborer. But you see the Kandi operator, so there is a bobbin kind of thing. If you have seen how a loom operates, and the yarn, it is wrapped around the bobbin, then the bobbin is fixed into the loom, and then the textile is yarned out. Right? So that the woman of the household, or maybe some male, they sit and they wrap the thread around the bobbin. That is normally done by family labor. But the loom operator or the some or such operations, they are normally wage laborers, because they are kind of specialized. And one loom operator can look at, say, 2-3 different, I think 4 set of looms they could operate simultaneously.
Can I?
I hope that answers you somehow. Yes, sir. I can see you.
Yeah, I was wondering, Meghna, between the two R's, the capital R and the big small r.
Yes, sir.
Smaller is same across all the production units. That is understandable. That's a common sector. But so far as the capital R is concerned, I'm not very sure whether this value will be same for all the units. Are you getting?
See, if I am borrowing,
yeah, the borrowing. And secondly, as you said in the model that this borrowing is not straight borrowing, that you take a borrow a couple of thousand rupees. It is an informal way of borrowing because the middleman produce in advance, and in exchange of that, they get the finished product with good taste. Are you getting it? So it is a practice of giving a loan, but it is not a kind of loan which you can find out what is the implied interest rate. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
To the extent that you cannot, let's say if you go to the informal market in Patna, okay, or in a village economy, quite often I think the nowadays rate is about 5% per month, which is about 60%, which is nearly 6 times to 7 times the rate in the formal market. That's about 10%. Okay, that's it. Now, what would be the similar case in this case between the small r and the big R? Capital R. Okay. The reason I'm asking this question is the most important reason there is a structural difference between the smaller units and the bigger units is this operation of the capital market. Okay.
Yes.
So I can understand that smaller is fairly constant for all the units, but I don't think the capital R is constant for all the units. So I was wondering if it is possible to get some information about the distribution of capital R. Okay, probably starts from 20%, then goes 30, 40%. Yeah. If that information is available, then it will probably be even more complete understanding of the whole process. Am I clear?
Yes, I understood your point. So I will like to answer your question in 2 parts. First, in the model, the capital R that we have taken it to be a single, for the simplicity of the model, for the operational reasons, we have taken it to be a single R.
Yes, I can understand that.
Yes. So that is a formal borrowing rate. But actuality in the field, yes, this R vary. But see, this R varies more. The distribution of the R is significantly more when the borrowing is from friend, family, so on, or local money lenders.
That's exactly.
But when I am borrowing from a formal firm, suppose there are 10 formal firms. One is charging me 8%, another 18%, another 30%. Then as a small farm owner, I would like to work for the farm which is charging 8%. So nobody will go to the farm who is charging 30%. Right? So between the formal sector firm against, there is some homogeneity in the interest rate or repayment rate, I should say. I should not say interest rate, that I should say repayment rate in what they charge. But when it is borrowing from other sources, for example, there is something called a bishi, right? It is more like many people come together, pool their farm, and they take turns. So each of the member take turn in getting the entire pool, right? So there are many such rating credit in both the places. There, the interest rate between each of the groups might fluctuate. We do not have exact, though we did ask them what is their repayment rate, but we have not found out actually a distribution rate. But you are right, sir, that this distribution rate may not be entirely homogeneous. There will be a distribution. It is not a single rate. Definitely.
You see, that the distribution of R will give some additional information about the extent of problem. That's how you want. Yes.
Sir, is it my network problem? Sorry, I couldn't hear you, sir.
I understood what you said. Only thing that I was trying to underline is that if you have some data on the distribution of R, capital R, then that will give us an even deeper explanation of the phenomenon that you are trying to explain. Okay.
Yes, we can look into it because I think we have the data, though the range was very narrow.
That's all. Yeah. And my own impression is that I have not worked on this field, that within a small geographical area, say one village, maybe it is nearly constant, 60% I was telling. But even in Bihar, if you go from one village to another village, which is about 20 kilometers away, that may not be 60% again. That might be 6% per month, resulting in 72% in a year. Same thing would happen in urban areas also.
Yes, I think that is also the principle of the microfinance institute, right? Because they charge weekly and fortnightly, the actual amount of interest that gets accumulated when you account for it yearly, that's like huge. But because you say weekly, it turns out to be very small.
Yeah, I know.
May I ask a question? Meghna, this is a very nice presentation. It's a very new area for me, so pardon me if my questions don't make sense. So how do these small scale power looms, how long does it take for them to go from the stage of achieving growth and sustaining them? Because if they're facing stiff competition in the context of liberalization as well, so how many firms, especially from the smaller segment, sustain in the whole scenario? Because if they're facing stiff competition as well, and they're investing, it's largely home-based how they start their production. So,
See, the products from Sholapur is actually of exportable quality. So the Sholapur chaddars and all are also exported. So if we look at the demand that they have, it's huge. There is no problem with that kind of market. So it is not like because of globalization, they are doomed. And because they have an advantage in terms of labor and cost, more than globalization, it is the existing structure of production in which they are right now. That is what is hampering them. So the formal sector firms have absolutely no incentive in allowing the informal firms to be self-sustaining. So if the informal firms can produce informally, because they use, they have a cost advantage because they are in the informal sector. So if they are more productive, they have access to credit, they will be independent on their own, and they would be competition for the big formal sector firms, right? So the big formal sector firms actually will tend to lose out. So they have every reason to keep the informal firms informal and make them work for themselves, right? So the major problem that the informal sector firms face is from the dominance of the formal sector firms itself, who do not want them to be independent.
got it. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Would anyone else like to give any comments? Okay, so I think it was absolutely clear and very lucid presentation.
I would like to believe so.
No, it was indeed a very interesting talk for all of us, and particularly it's interesting because Neeladri is also a co-author of
And
the
he
paper.
chooses to keep quiet and not answer the questions.
No, because it's nice because many times what happens is we don't know what your colleague is working on. So
Yes.
this is a good way to know what each other is working on. And I really hope that we have more such talks and more such presentations. And I really thank you a lot for agreeing to give a talk at such a short notice. It was a pleasure, and hope when things are a bit better, we have you in.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you so much for allowing me to give this talk. Thank you.
So thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I think we can just disconnect now. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.